Welcome back to Occult Archives, where, we always uncover the mysteries and myths and legends behind some of history's most feared books.
From mystical grimoires to secrets too dangerous to be read.
Right, exactly. And today we're diving really deep into a book that sits, well, it's a bit outside the mainstream. It's called The Aquarian Gospel of Jesus the Christ by Levi H. Dowling.
Oh, this is a fascinating one. Published in 1908, it presents a very unique perspective on the life and teachings of Jesus. Dowling claims that it's not a new revelation, but rather a record drawn from, well, he calls them the hidden Akashic Records. And he says it's particularly relevant now as we transition from the Piscean age to the Aquarian age.
Okay, so the book actually spends some time explaining what these ages are, right? So the Piscine age, the one we're supposedly leaving behind, is described as an age of water, symbolized by the fish, which I think many of our listeners will recognize as a symbol that's often seen in early Christian imagery.
Absolutely. And the Aquarian age, the one we're moving into, is characterized as an age of air, electricity, magnetism, all that kind of stuff. And its symbol is the water bearer, which, interestingly enough, in astrology, Aquarius is an air sign, even though it has aqua in the name.
It's almost like that symbolism is pointing towards this idea of a shift in consciousness
Yeah.
from something more, fluid and emotional to something more mental and ethereal.
Right, exactly. And the Aquarian Gospel suggests that this Aquarian age is, well, it calls it preeminently a spiritual age. The idea being that now more than ever, people are supposedly developing this higher spiritual awareness that allows them to grasp the deeper spiritual meanings embedded within Jesus' teachings.
So it's almost like it's saying that now is the time when these teachings can truly be understood and really make an impact.
That's the idea, yeah. And what I find really interesting about the book's stated purpose is that it really sets out to explore some of the more surprising, perhaps even forbidden teachings
Hmm.
that are revealed through this unique Aquarian age lens on Jesus's life. It's a very different take than what you might be used to if you're familiar with the traditional Gospels.
Right, and that's exactly what we're going to do in this deep dive today. We're going to explore some of these less conventional teachings that are presented in the Aquarian Gospel, keeping in mind this idea of a new spiritual era that it describes. But let's start at the beginning with Jesus's early life as the book portrays it.
Yeah, good idea. The text actually offers a lot of detail about Jesus' childhood and youth that you generally won't find in the canonical Gospels. Chapter 1, for example, describes a young Jesus in the Temple at Jerusalem with the Master Hillel. What strikes you about that particular account?
Well, even at such a young age, Jesus seems to have this innate understanding of a God of love, and he even suggests that true worship isn't so much about outward rituals, but rather about purifying our hearts to create like an inner sanctuary, a temple within where this God of love can reside. It's a very, very inward focused spirituality from the get-go.
Absolutely. It's a noticeable shift from the more external ritualistic practices that were prevalent in temple worship at that time.
Hmm.
And then later in the book, in chapter 19, we see Jesus at age 12 back in the temple again. This time he's reading from a book of prophecy, specifically Isaiah's words about Ariel, and at Hillel's request, he offers his interpretation.
It really paints this picture of his early wisdom and his profound connection to the prophetic tradition. Even as a young boy, it's like he's not just a child, but already deeply attuned to these deeper spiritual currents that are flowing beneath the surface.
Right. And then we move into some territory that's quite different from the traditional Christian narratives. The Aquarian Gospel implies that Jesus actually traveled extensively and taught in India and Nepal, which is, something that's entirely absent from the biblical accounts.
Yeah, chapter 31 actually goes into this in some detail.
Yeah.
It mentions Brahmic priests in India reacting very, very strongly to Jesus's teachings, going so far as to plot his death. And it's only through a warning from individuals called lamas that he escapes to Nepal. So it's introducing this whole other Eastern dimension to Jesus's life story that most people probably haven't even considered.
And what's interesting is not just the travel itself, but the nature of his teachings in that context. The book records Jesus preaching the brotherhood of life, the righteousness of equal rights, and the uselessness of priests and sacrificial rites while in India. And this really echoes some of the themes we saw earlier in his interactions within the Jerusalem temple.
Yeah, it definitely seems to be consistent in its critique of hierarchical religious structures and external rituals, always emphasizing this more direct and personal connection to the divine.
Exactly. And staying within chapter 31 for a moment, there's this prophecy attributed to a figure named Vidyapati about a future age where outward displays of piety will be like the norm. And this is contrasted with Jesus' own simple practices.
So if we connect that to this larger idea of the Aquarian age being this spiritual age, it's almost like a critique of how religion might evolve, potentially becoming more about appearances and less about genuine inner transformation.
Right, and that's definitely something to consider. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about some of the core theological concepts presented in the Aquarian Gospel, specifically the relationship between the Logos, the Christ, and Jesus. The book draws some pretty nuanced distinctions here.
Yeah, chapter 65 introduces the Logos as love made manifest at the beginning of Jesus' Christine ministry, using Christine to refer to the Christ principle.
Right, and then chapter 68 really clarifies that distinction, stating explicitly that Jesus is not king, at least not in an earthly political sense, but rather that the Christ is universal love, and love is king. And Jesus is then presented as like a temple through which Christ can manifest to men.
So what it's saying is that Jesus isn't the Christ exclusively, but rather a vessel, a highly evolved individual through whom this universal principle of love, the Christ, could express itself.
Exactly. And this opens up the possibility of the Christ within, which the text goes on to discuss how this Christ within can be cultivated in everyone through, purified hearts and faith.
Yeah.
It's a much more inclusive concept than the idea of a singular, exclusively divine figure.
Okay, so how does the Aquarian Gospel then reinterpret some of the more familiar narratives from the traditional Gospels in light of this understanding? Take, for example, the temptation in the wilderness.
Well, in chapter 65, the tempter's questions center around Jesus' sonship and his ability to perform miracles. But Jesus' response is very telling. He emphasizes that his words and deeds in all the walks of life will be the true testament to his messiahship, not just these grand displays of power.
So it's shifting the focus away from the sensational and towards a more consistent embodiment of love and righteousness in everyday life.
Precisely. And then there's his teaching about the kingdom at hand in chapter 66. This isn't presented as a physical, earthly kingdom in the Aquarian Gospel.
Right, it's described as a kingdom of the soul, one that requires inner purification. John the Baptist, referred to as the key keeper of the age, opens the gates, but you have to be willing to prune yourself of every evil thought and overcome selfish desires to actually enter into this kingdom.
Absolutely. And then we have the encounter with Nicodemus in chapter 75, where the concept of the birth of holy breath is introduced, leading to eternal life through belief in the only Son sent by a loving God. How do you see this fitting into the whole Aquarian age framework?
Well, I think the birth of holy breath can be understood as this kind of awakening to this inner Christ consciousness, this spiritual rebirth that's facilitated by the universal love embodied by the Christ. And the only Son here isn't necessarily limited to Jesus, but represents that potential for divine connection that exists within every individual.
Yeah, that's a good point. Now let's move on to some of the more socially progressive teachings that are attributed to Jesus in the Aquarian Gospel, particularly those surrounding brotherhood, equality, and the rejection of caste systems. These would have been pretty radical ideas for many people back then.
Chapter 31, again, drawing from the narrative in India, is very clear on this. Jesus is depicted preaching the brotherhood of life, the righteousness of equal rights, and the uselessness of priests and sacrificial rites directly to the Brahmic priests, which is a pretty direct challenge to the established social and religious hierarchies of the time.
It is. And it goes even further, predicting a future perfect age where every man will be a priest and outward religious garb will be unnecessary. It's a really fascinating vision of a truly egalitarian spiritual landscape.
Yeah, and that emphasis on universalism extends to Jesus's interactions with the Samaritans in chapter 82. The text really highlights the universal nature of the Christ and God's equal love for all people, transcending religious and ethnic boundaries, Jews, Greeks, Samaritans, it doesn't matter.
Right. It's this powerful message of inclusivity, suggesting that the divine isn't confined to any one group or tradition. Now, let's touch on some of the more esoteric concepts presented in the book, like the omnific word and the idea of attaining spiritual power. These might be, new territory for some of our listeners.
Yeah, chapter 89 introduces this omnific word through which the disciples could seemingly control the elements and possess the keys of life and death, which almost sounds like something out of a fantasy novel,
It does. But what's really interesting is Jesus' explanation in chapter 91. He teaches that this power to perform great works isn't exclusive to him, but can be attained by anyone who conquers their lower self. It's presented as a potential that's inherent in all human beings, accessible through spiritual discipline.
So it's reframing miracles, right? Shifting it from something supernatural bestowed upon a select few to a potential that lies dormant within everyone.
Exactly. And then you have the Good Shepherd parable in chapter 139, which the Aquarian Gospel provides a very specific interpretation of.
Right. Jesus declares himself the shepherd of the sheep, but the Christ is identified as the gateway of the fold, suggesting that while Jesus embodies the guiding principle, it's the universal Christ consciousness that provides access to spiritual nourishment and safety.
It really reinforces that distinction we were talking about earlier, Jesus as the exemplar, but the Christ as the path.
Now, as we get to the end of Jesus's earthly ministry as depicted in the Aquarian Gospel, there are some interesting variations on the traditional departure narratives.
Yeah, in chapter 140, Jesus foreshadows his departure, stating that he will lay my body down and go to him who is the all, promising to return in 40 days towards Jerusalem for a willing sacrifice.
And then in Gethsemane in chapter 167, there's this explanation of the Trinity given to Peter, James, and John. God the Father is might, God the Mother is omniscience or holy breath, and God the Son is love or the Christ. But what's really striking is Jesus' statement that every man is God made flesh.
Yeah, that's a huge statement, really underscoring the inherent divinity within humanity, which is a core theme of the Aquarian age as presented in this text. And it goes right along with the idea of the Christ within.
And then after his farewell to Pilate in chapter 168, the book describes Jesus' disappearance, implying a transcendence beyond physical limitations rather than a straightforward crucifixion.
And then he appears to the Magian priests in chapter 176 with a crown of light, declaring the transmutation of his human flesh to flesh divine as a message for all humanity. Again, it's shifting the focus away from suffering and death and towards this idea of spiritual transformation.
And the final chapter we're looking at, chapter 177, describes a stranger, implied to be Jesus materialized, appearing in the temple after the crucifixion. He questions the rulers and reveals himself, causing fear and astonishment.
It's like he's still present, still challenging the established authorities, even after his supposed death.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we've really covered some key themes from the Aquarian Gospel, this idea of a transition to a spiritual age, a reinterpretation of Jesus's identity and mission, a strong emphasis on inner spiritual transformation, the concept of universal brotherhood, and this recurring notion of human divinity.
It's important to remember, though, that this book offers a very unique and distinct perspective, one that often diverges quite significantly from traditional biblical narratives and introduces concepts that aren't typically found in mainstream Christian theology.
So our final thought for you today is this. Considering this Aquarian Age framework, how might these perhaps unexpected teachings about human potential and the nature of the divine resonate with contemporary spiritual seekers? What does it mean for you if the Christ is understood as a universal principle, accessible within, rather than solely as a historical figure?
It's a question worth pondering. It definitely invites a different way of approaching spirituality and your own place in the grand scheme of things.
We encourage you to explore the Aquarian Gospel for yourself and see what you think. It's a book that really challenges conventional understandings and provokes thought.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for listening.
We'll see you next time.